Again, everybody, it's Janine from Kodennected Ltd. Today's topic is how common is narcissism and why their behavior is so predictable. So how many narcissists are actually out there? And this is one of the most common questions I get. And it's also one of the most misunderstood, because the real issue isn't how many people meet a label. It's why certain people create the same emotional confusion again and again across different relationships. And today we're going to be looking at what the research really says about how common narcissism is, why narcissism exists on a spectrum, and why people with these traits show specific predictable behavioral patterns. And most importantly, how understanding those patterns restores clarity, control, and dignity to the person that's dealing with them. So why the how many narcissists are there is such a complicated question. So let's start with an important distinction. In psychology, narcissism is not one thing. There are two very different levels we talk about. Narcissism as a diagnosis in terms of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, and narcissism as a set of personality traits, and they are not the same. And confusing them is where a lot of misinformation starts. So the clinical narcissism, the diagnosis, at the diagnostic level, we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, and this is a clinical diagnosis with strict criteria, okay? There are enduring patterns across contexts, causing impairment or harm, and are present over time. The large peer-reviewed study suggests that on average, around 1% of people meet full diagnostic criteria. Some large national surveys have found rates as high as 6%. And that's a wide range, and it exists because diagnosis depends heavily on how it's measured, who's doing the measuring, and cultural context. And when someone says everyone is a narcissist, that's not supported by science. True clinical NPD is relatively uncommon, but we also have to think about how someone would get a diagnosis. And, the traits of narcissism does not suggest that there's going to be a lot of narcissists that go willingly to get a diagnosis. And that's probably a lot of that mismatch where we think about things. The trait narcissism, where most confusion comes from. So here's where things sort of get nuanced. And most research doesn't treat narcissism as a yes or no diagnosis. It treats it as a spectrum of traits. So traits like entitlement, grandiosity, hypersensitivity to criticism, low empathy, defensiveness, need for admiration, and a need for control. These traits are normally distributed across the population, which means most people have some, fewer people have a lot, and a small group have them in intense, rigid combinations. And this is why there's no single scientific percentage for covert narcissism, vulnerable narcissism, communal narcissism, or so-called malignant narcissism. Those are patterns of traits, not population characteristics. So the different expressions of narcissism, research does, however, clearly identify these different expressions. So the grandiose narcissism is very overt, confidence, dominance, entitlement, and low tolerance for criticism. And these sort of encompass the basis of all narcissistic traits when we're looking at things. There's the vulnerable or covert narcissism, where there's display of shame, hypersensitivity, withdrawal, passive aggression, and victim identity. Communal narcissism is a grandiosity expressed through being the most caring, moral superiority, identity built around helping, rescuing, or being needed in a sort of martyr way. There's malignant narcissism, which is a clinical concept and not a prevalence category. But narcissistic traits combined with aggression, antisocial features, paranoia, and cruelty. So different expressions, but the same underlying dynamics. But the main part that seems to be relevant for all of us, I think, is that there are some behaviors that are very predictable with all this. And this is the part that matters most for healing. So people with strong narcissistic traits do not behave randomly. They behave in patterned, predictable ways because personality traits sort of shape how threat is perceived, how emotions are regulated, and how relationships are managed. Across decades of research, the same patterns appear. The core behavioral patterns, which are the most consistent, are ego threat, resulting in defense. So when their self-image is challenged, that's when blame appears, criticism is deflected, responsibility is avoided, and the other person becomes the problem. The need for control over repair. Instead of curiosity or accountability, there's withdrawal or punishment, stonewalling or dominance. And repair feels dangerous because it requires humility. There's low empathy under stress. Empathy may exist when things are calm, cognitively. It collapses under emotional demand. And this is why care feels conditional. And repetition across relationships. So the same conflicts, the same endings, the same narratives, but with different people. And this repetition is the giveaway. So it's prevalent in all aspects, all relationships in their lives. So why understanding these patterns restores control? And here's the nervous system piece. The brain is wired for prediction. Unpredictability equals threat. Patterns equal safety. So when someone doesn't understand these dynamics, they might ask, what did I do wrong? Or why does this keep happening? Or if I explain it better, will it change? And understanding the patterns will shift this to, this is the response I expected. This isn't about my worth. I can choose how close I stay. And that shift reduces the shame, the rumination, the self-blame, and the trauma bonding, because the predictability restores your agency. And it's not about blame or labeling. This work isn't about diagnosing people, attacking character, calling everybody a narcissist. It's about understanding trait-driven behavior, protecting nervous systems, restoring clarity to people who are made to doubt themselves. And you don't need a diagnosis to recognize a pattern, and you don't need permission to step away from harm. So, how common is narcissism? True, clinical narcissism is relatively rare. Narcissistic traits are much more common, maybe showing up in about 30 to 40% of the population. And when those traits cluster around entitlement, low empathy, and control, the behavior becomes predictable. And understanding that doesn't make you cynical, it makes you informed. And informed people stop blaming themselves for patterns that were never theirs to fix. You're doing better than you think.